Jeremy Clarkson's beer is in 4,000 pubs now. 5 years ago, 50. Sounds like a celebrity fad, doesn't it? It isn't. The major breweries are the ones getting nervous. Waitrose stocks it. Morrisons stocks it. British Airways pours it at 30,000 feet. Fluke or actually good? Today we find out. 50 pubs to 4,000, not over a decade, in a handful of years. If you've never worked in the pub trade, you might not appreciate how hard that actually is. A landlord's got maybe 8 or 10 lines on the bar, and every single one is already spoken for by breweries who've had that relationship for decades. Getting on isn't really about asking nicely. It's about knocking someone else off, and nobody hands that over willingly. Hawkstone did it anyway, and it didn't start with a sales pitch. It started in a farm shop, the sort of place you go for the sausages, and end up leaving with 3 other things you didn't plan on buying. A small batch brewed by a couple of local brewers, Rick and Emma, sold to people who came for lunch and left with a can of lager they weren't expecting to like as much as they did. Word spread the old way. Over garden fences, across pub tables. Nobody bought an ad for it because there wasn't one to buy. Then Clarkson invested, and the whole thing changed gear. Here's the bit that should actually worry the big breweries. It's not the growth itself, it's that it hasn't stopped. Novelty acts spike and die. You know the ones. Celebrity gin, celebrity whatever, everywhere for 18 months and then gone. This one's kept climbing year after year, which is the one thing a fad can never manage. When was the last time you saw a beer go from a farm shop shelf to a British Airways drinks trolley in under 5 years? That's not luck. That's a brand actually giving British drinkers what they've wanted for a while, without much apology for it. Numbers on a page are one thing, standing in the brewery is another. Concrete floors, still a bit dusty from the building work, wet grain in the air, sweet, almost bready, like a bakery before the ovens go on. Rows of brand new steel tanks standing where, not that long ago, there was just field, actual field, with sheep on it probably, knowing the Cotswolds. The land the brewery sits on wasn't even theirs a couple of years back. They've bought it since. A whole new production floor's gone in, freshly tiled, and I mean freshly, you can tell nobody's spilled a pint on it yet. Built to house fermentation vessels, the old site simply couldn't fit anymore. More tanks are on order, not to replace what's there, to add to it, because they've already outgrown an upgrade that isn't even finished yet. Try explaining that one to your accountant. And it hasn't come at the expense of anyone local. Hawkstone's committed to working almost entirely with British hop farmers, and in the last year alone their hop usage has pushed farming activity up 15% in that industry. One brewery, nudging the fortunes of a sector that had been quietly shrinking for decades. Not bad for a beer that started life next to the sausages. Most of this expansion is aimed at keg beer, not bottles. Draft for pub sellers. Because someone at Hawkstone clearly understands what the big boys seem to have forgotten, a pint at the bar does something a shelf never will. Someone tries it on a Friday night, likes it, and the next week they're buying a 4-pack because they want that feeling again at home. The pub is where you make the fan. The supermarket is where you keep them. People assume brewing's complicated. It really isn't, and I say that as someone who assumed the exact same thing. 4 ingredients: water, malted barley, hops, yeast. That's the list. That's genuinely it. Water's about 90% of what's in your glass, which sounds almost too simple to matter, until you realise soft or hard water. Mineral content, all of it shapes the beer before a hop's gone anywhere near it. Malted barley is where the real character comes from. Soaked, allowed to sprout a touch, then dried and roasted. The roast decides almost everything about how the finished beer looks and tastes. Light roast, you get that classic golden lager. Roast it further, and you move through amber, all the way to the near black of a stout. Chew a bit of malted barley on its own sometime, if you ever get the chance. It's a strange little experiment. At first it tastes of almost nothing, like cardboard. Keep chewing though, and your own saliva starts breaking the starch into sugar right there in your mouth, and suddenly you understand exactly what the yeast's about to do to it later. Roast it a bit longer and it turns toasted, almost like coffee, chocolate, burnt toast, that sort of thing. That's the entire gap between a pale lager and a stout, sitting in your hand before it's touched a drop of water. Then hops for bitterness and aroma. Citrus, pine, floral. Depending on the variety, hops happen to be the ingredient under the most pressure in Britain right now. The domestic industry's been shrinking since the 1880s, which is a genuinely long time to be in decline. So a brewery insisting on British hops isn't just a nice line for the can, it's propping farms up that would otherwise probably give up on the crop altogether. And yeast, which does the actual work, It eats the sugar the malt released, and out comes alcohol and carbon dioxide. Your bubbles. A single-strain lager yeast gives you that clean, crisp character, rather than the fruitier stuff you'd get from an ale yeast. 4 ingredients. No stabilizers, no artificial colour, nothing smuggled in to cover a shortcut. Here's one most people walk straight past without ever clocking it. Next time you're in the drinks aisle, actually look at the glass. Dark, almost opaque bottles next to clear or pale green ones. That's not branding, that's chemistry. And once you know it, you'll never unsee it. UV light reacts with compounds in hops and can turn beer skunky. A genuinely unpleasant off flavour, and not a subtle one either. Brewers have known this for well over a century, and the fix is simple. Dark glass, which blocks the light out. Champagne houses have always used it. Marmite comes in a brown jar for the same reason. So does proper olive oil, if you've ever wondered why. But dark glass costs more, and if you're chasing the thinnest possible margin across millions of units, that adds up fast. So some producers use cheaper, lighter glass, and compensate with additives to stop it reacting so badly to the light. You end up with a beer built around the shortcut, rather than packaging chosen to protect what's actually in it. Hawkstone uses proper dark glass, not just because it looks more premium on a shelf, though it does, but because it's the honest way to protect a beer that hasn't had its recipe compromised to survive cheap packaging. Quick one before we carry on. If you're finding this interesting, hit like. Tell me in the comments whether you're lager or stout, and if you're not subscribed yet, do that too. Bell on, so you don't miss what's coming. Right, dark beer versus light beer. There's this idea floating around pub culture that dark beer is automatically stronger, heavier, more of a commitment than a lager. I believed it myself for years, if I'm honest. Not true. The reason takes us straight back to that roasting process. Colour comes almost entirely from how long the barley's been roasted, not from strength. A pale lager uses lightly roasted malt for that golden colour and crisp character. Roast it darker and you head toward amber, then near black. But the alcohol can be nearly identical between the two. You could genuinely have a pale beer that's stronger than the stout sitting next to it, and most people would never guess. What roasting actually changes is complexity. Light roast gives you something clean and refreshing, the kind of beer for a hot afternoon. Dark roast gives you toasted, coffee-like, almost chocolatey notes, something you nurse by a fire rather than knock back in the sun. Hawkstone brews across that whole range. Their core lager sits pale, clean, sessionable. Hawkstone Black sits at the other end entirely, built from more heavily roasted barley for people who want weight and depth. Same 4 ingredients, completely different pint, all down to time in the roaster. So grain to glass. This is what actually happens. Hot water and grain go into a vessel called a mash tun. The grain steeps for about an hour, and the natural sugars locked inside the barley get drawn out into the liquid, along with the colour. What's left is a sweet, sugary liquid brewers call wort, the raw material every beer starts as. That wort moves on, and the spent grain gets left behind. Small detail worth noting, that grain doesn't get binned. It goes to local farmers as cattle feed, and this is the bit I actually like, some of it comes back round to the brewery's own taproom as cheese and milk, genuinely closed loop, whether or not anyone at Hawkstone planned it that neatly. Hops go in next, infusing for about an hour, for bitterness and aroma. Technically, you've got a finished brew at this point. The real transformation hasn't happened yet. Single-strain lager yeast goes into the fermentation vessel and gets straight to work. First, it's aerobic. It multiplies using oxygen and produces carbon dioxide as it goes. That's your bubbles, and they're a genuine byproduct of fermentation, not injected the way a fizzy soft drink is carbonated. It's why naturally carbonated beer has a finer, gentler bubble than something forced full of gas. Once the oxygen's gone, the yeast switches to converting the remaining sugar into alcohol. All of this happens in tall, cone-bottomed tanks, so the spent yeast, hops and malt can settle down toward the narrow base. A single brew of around 5,000 litres works out to roughly 10,000 pints. That's one brew. They're doing several a week now, which tells you how far this has come from a farm shop shelf next to the sausages. Fermentation finishing doesn't mean the beer's done, it just means the loud part's over. This next bit is quieter, slower, And it's exactly where Hawkstone does something most mass-market breweries stopped bothering with a while ago. The beer moves into lagering, a conditioning period before it's ever packaged, where it just sits essentially, getting better at doing nothing. Big commercial breweries, chasing revenue and turnover, keep this stage as short as they can possibly get away with, because every day a tank isn't emptied, and refilled is a day it isn't making money. Hawkstone stretches it out instead. Longer conditioning gives you a smoother, more developed beer, rounder on the palate, less harsh at the edges, but it means tying up tank space and capital for longer, which most producers under pressure to keep stock moving simply won't do. Patience, in other words, and that's not a word you associate with big industry very often. It's almost old-fashioned, the way a good cheese or a proper ham is old-fashioned. Somebody, somewhere, decided that waiting was worth more than the extra turnover. Once it's conditioned, it needs clarifying. Lager should pour bright and clear, not cloudy. That's part of the whole point of the style. Rather than chemical fining agents, which is what a lot of the industry reaches for, the beer's spun through a centrifuge at around 8,000 revolutions a minute, roughly 100 times the force of gravity, which is a slightly mad amount of force for something that's about to end up sitting quietly in a pint glass on a beer mat. That force is enough to physically separate the last bits of malt, hops and yeast from the liquid. No additives involved, nothing to disguise, just physics doing the job chemistry usually does elsewhere. Add it all up, the spent grain going back to local farms rather than a skip, the natural clarification instead of a chemical shortcut, the British hops keeping struggling farms afloat rather than sourcing whatever's cheapest from wherever it's cheapest. None of it was really planned as a sustainability strategy, as far as I can tell. Nobody slapped a green leaf logo on the can shouting about it. It's sustainable almost as an accident, a side effect of doing things properly, rather than doing them fast. Which, if you ask me, is a far more convincing version of sustainable than the kind that gets announced in a press release. Does any of this actually change the taste? Yes. Genuinely yes, not a diplomatic yes. And it comes down to nearly every choice we've just walked through, stacked one on top of the other until the difference is impossible to miss once you know what you're tasting for. Water's 90% of the beer, and there's no chemical stabilising needed because the dark glass already protects it from light before it ever gets the chance to go skunky. A lot of mass-market lager relies on additives, specifically because it's bottled in cheap, light-exposed glass, which is a cost the drinker never sees but absolutely tastes. Hawkstone sidesteps that entirely, simply by paying for the right bottle in the first place. Natural carbonation from actual fermentation, rather than forced carbonated the way a soft drink is, gives it a finer, gentler bubble. Smaller, less aggressive on the tongue, which sounds like a small thing until you've had 2 pints side by side and noticed it. The extended lagering trades speed for depth, giving the flavour time to round itself out rather than rushing it to the tap. The centrifuge replaces chemical fining, so what's left in the glass is genuinely just beer, rather than beer plus whatever's needed to make beer behave. None of those taken alone sound like much. I'll be honest about that. A finer bubble here, a longer weight there, but stack them together and you get a beer that's noticeably cleaner and more rounded than something built for volume at breakneck speed, the kind of difference you notice even if you couldn't explain why. And underneath all of it, holding the whole thing up, British barley, some of it grown on Clarkson's own farm, and British hops sourced specifically to keep a declining industry alive rather than bought wherever the spreadsheet says is cheapest this quarter. This wasn't engineered by committee to hit the widest possible palette at the lowest possible cost, the way so much of the beer aisle clearly has been. It was made, as far as anyone can tell, by people who cared more about it being good than about shaving a fraction off the unit price. That's not a small distinction. That's basically the whole story. Which brings us to the strategy sitting underneath all of it. And it tells you, more than anything else in this video, that this is a long game. Not a quick payday, cashing in on a famous name while it's still fashionable. That keg focus we mentioned earlier, restaurants, pubs, bars, that's still where the real energy's going. Even now, even with supermarket shelves filling up nicely, and the temptation to just chase easy volume sitting right there. The logic's simple, and it's the same logic that's been true of pubs for about as long as pubs have existed. Someone tries a pint at their local, likes it, maybe doesn't think much of it in the moment, and then next time they're doing the shop, they reach for the 4-pack they've already tasted, rather than gamble on something they haven't. The pub is where the loyalty actually gets built. The supermarket is just where you cash it in. There's something almost stubborn about doubling down on pubs right now, At a moment when the trade is under about as much pressure as it's ever been, closures nearly every week somewhere in the country, rising costs, younger drinkers changing their habits entirely, some of them barely drinking at all. Plenty of brands would look at those headwinds and quietly pivot, pour everything into supermarket listings instead, since it's a lot less work than building a relationship with 4,000 individual pubs, one landlord at a time. Hawkstone's gone the other way, deliberately it seems, rather than by accident. Every pub that takes it on isn't just a sale on a spreadsheet, it's a shot at a fan for life, someone who will order it without thinking in 5 years' time, and apparently that's worth more to Hawkstone than the easier route would be. It's a bet on the pub itself, really. At a moment, plenty of people had quietly written the pub off as a dying institution, and going from 50 to 4,000, in the middle of everything the trade's been through, suggests it's a bet that's paying off rather more than anyone expected. So, back to where we started. 4,000 pubs, major brewers watching this a lot more closely than they'd probably admit to. A brand that went from a farm shop shelf to a British Airways trolley in a handful of years. Now you know why. Dark glass instead of shortcuts. 4 honest ingredients and nothing else. A lagering process most breweries won't spare the tank space for. A centrifuge instead of chemicals. British barley, British hops. A farming economy that's genuinely better off because this brand exists. And a strategy built pub by pub rather than chasing the fastest possible payday. Is Jeremy Clarkson's beer overrated? No, not close, and honestly I went into this expecting to be a bit more cynical about it. What's actually remarkable about Hawkstone isn't that a famous face attached itself to a beer and it sold. That's happened before, plenty of times, and it usually fades once the novelty wears off. What's remarkable is that underneath the famous face, there's a properly well-made product, brewed with more patience than most of what it's now quietly outselling. The big brewers aren't nervous because Clarkson's famous. They're nervous because the beer's actually good and people have noticed. That's a far more dangerous combination. That's the story behind the beer that's got the whole industry watching over its shoulder. From a farm shop in the Cotswolds to bars across the country, with a lot more care going into it than most people give it credit for. If you enjoyed this one, like the video, tell me in the comments if you've tried Hawkstone yourself and what you thought. Don't just say, yeah, it's nice. I want details. If you're not subscribed yet, now's the moment. Bell on, so you don't miss the next one. There's plenty more of Clarkson's empire left to dig into. Until next time, pour yourself something decent.